This high IQ student were tasked to create a high-stakes project by their professor, but it turns out that what they are making is a high-tech military weapon that kills people. Hello, welcome back to IM Movies. Today we're looking back into the 1985 American science fiction film called Real Genius. But before we jump into the details, make sure to show us some love by liking the video and subscribing to the channel. Now, let's get right into it. The movie begins with a 15-year-old high school science genius named Mitch Taylor. Mitch Taylor had just invented a flashlight-pumped ultraviolet laser, which he presents at his high school's science fair. Well, I don't know what a flashlight-pumped ultraviolet laser does, and neither did his parents, Mr. and Mrs. Taylor, but they showed up to support their son anyway. At the science fair, Mitch meets a university professor named Jerry Hathaway, who offers him a scholarship to study at Pacific Technical University, with the opportunity to work with other brilliant minds on a project that Jerry had secretly undertaken from the CIA. So the thing is, the CIA had hired Jerry to develop a power source for a laser weapon called Crossbow. This weapon is specifically intended to be used from space to carry out assassinations. Jerry, being an opportunist, had decided to recruit genius students to do the work for him, and Mitch is his latest prospect. After being admitted into Pacific Technical University, Mitch finds himself in a rather strange environment, at least not as he had imagined it. On getting to his room, a strange person gets Mitch's attention as he sees a weird-looking man sneaking into his closet. Mitch immediately goes to check what the man might be doing in the closet, but can't seem to find anybody, or even any exit leading out of the closet, feeling like he just saw a ghost. Shortly after that, Mitch meets his roommate, Chris Knight, another member of Jerry's team and a legend in the National Physics Club, who also happens to be one of Mitch's idols. Although Chris doesn't act much like the genius Mitch had imagined him to be, however, I think Mitch finds him interesting. Meanwhile, Jerry has been using the money meant for hiring experts for the project to renovate his house, which is why he resorted to using brilliant students as cheap labor. The next day, Mitch arrives at Jerry's lab where he meets Jerry's other students, Kent, Bodie, and George. On seeing Mitch, Kent, the leader of the group, assumes he must be a food delivery boy and asks him to drop whatever he brought and leave. However, Mitch introduces himself as Jerry's new student, stating that he has come to check their work for errors. Feeling humiliated by Mitch's words, Kent warns him to know his place, bragging that he's next in line of command after Jerry. Shortly after this, Jerry steps in and introduces Mitch to the team, instructing them to update Mitch on the progress of the project, further revealing that the 15-year-old boy will now lead the team due to his vast knowledge of laser physics, leaving Kent in shock. I mean, who does that? Afterward, Bodie reveals to Jerry that the laser beam machine that Chris built is now broken, stating that it would take at least a week to fix. However, Mitch swiftly notices the error and fixes it, proving that he's a real genius. The next day, Mitch prepares to go to the library but slips just as he attempts to step outside his room, falling on a hip of ice created by a student named Ick. Mitch gets pulled up by Chris, who happens to be skating on the ice right in the hallway. Shortly after that, a young serial inventor, Jordan, slides down the hallway using a snow sled she'd built. However, Jordan gets thrown off the sled halfway, and Mitch rushes over to help her up. Subsequently, Jordan introduces herself to Mitch, who keeps smiling and staring at her like a lover boy. Later that night, Mitch watches as the strange-looking man sneaks into the closet again, and he rushes over to see his exit point but can't find any clue as to how he manages to disappear in the closet. The next day, Mitch tells Chris about his earlier experience, asking him if he knows about a guy living in their closet. However, Chris only tells him that the name of the guy is Laszlo, making it look like it isn't a big deal. Now, despite being fully engaged with Jerry's project, Mitch regularly attends class, gets involved in other projects, and wouldn't miss going to class for anything, even if he's the only one in attendance. At some point, lecturers stopped coming to class, but Mitch always showed up. Despite being overwhelmed by this workload, Mitch still stuck to his constant study routine. One day, out of curiosity, Mitch decides to investigate how Laszlo manages to vanish inside the closet. So after a while, he discovers a secret passage that leads into a mechanized tunnel under the university where Laszlo conducts his experiments. With the deadline for the project approaching, Jerry invites Chris over to his house. Chris arrives at Jerry's residence eating popcorn, but Jerry asks him to put it away, stating that he hates it. Afterward, Jerry begins to challenge Chris about his nonchalant attitude toward the laser project, but Chris tells him that he's been putting Mitch through the process, reminding Jerry that he'll be graduating soon. However, Jerry also reminds Chris that he'll need to pass his course to graduate, threatening to make sure it doesn't happen if he doesn't follow his order, subsequently asking him to deliver the 5-megawatt power source project by midday. Back in the lab, Chris notices that the urgency of the project is taking a toll on Mitch, so he decides to help him cool off by taking him to a pool party he had organized. Later, Kent sneaks into the party. Kent decides to report it to Jerry. On hearing this, Jerry storms into the party venue and blows hot at Mitch, stating how disappointed he is for recommending him for the scholarship. After this incident, Mitch, feeling frustrated, returns to the lab to work, but can't seem to concentrate. With this, Mitch decides to call his parents, breaking down in tears as he narrates his ordeal, telling them that he's tired and wants to come home. Meanwhile, Kent and his gang mischievously record the call. The next day, they play the recorded conversation of Mitch's call with his parents on the school's public address system, just to mock him. Feeling humiliated, Mitch leaves the dining hall to his room and packs his bags to leave. However, Chris convinces him to stay, relaying his personal experiences and the pressure that comes with being smarter than everyone else. Chris also tells him the story of how Laszlo used to be the brightest student at Pacific in the 70s, and how he ended up living in the tunnel after he cracked due to school pressure and the burden of overstudying. With this, Mitch decides to balance his study lifestyle, and Chris promises to help get revenge. Later that night, with the help of Jordan and Nick, they disassemble Kent's car and reassemble it in his dorm room. On seeing this, Kent promises to report them to Jerry, stating that they'll regret it. Shortly after, Chris gets summoned to Jerry's house. On getting there, Jerry, angry about the incomplete project, informs Chris that he has decided to transfer Chris's post-graduation job offer to Kent, adding that he'll make sure he fails and also take steps to ensure Chris never finds a job in the field of physics. Later that night, Mitch finds Chris in a sad state, suggesting that he wants to quit. Realizing what had just happened, Mitch suggests that Chris get even with Jerry, advising him not to quit just like he'd advised him earlier. With this, the two commit themselves to completing the project and making sure Chris passes his final exams. Subsequently, Chris turns a new leaf and starts taking things seriously, as he subsequently begins to attend classes, tirelessly work on the project, and study hard for his final exams. One day, Laszlo reveals to Mitch and Chris that he has calculated a 34% win in a sweepstake, and was bound to win it. Looking at how tired they look after a wild studying session, Laszlo promises to give Chris all the questions that Jerry has ever set. However, when Chris asks him for the questions, Laszlo reveals that he didn't have them written down, stating that he had them memorized. On the day of the exam, Kent notices that Chris is getting closer to completing the project, so he decides to stay back and sabotage it by messing with the optics in order to get even with Chris. Shortly after the exams, Chris returns to the lab to continue testing the laser machine, but instead of shooting out a laser beam, it goes up in flames, destroying parts of the machine. However, Kent later brags about being responsible for it. Now, even though Chris knows that Kent is responsible for destroying the laser machine, he realizes there isn't much that he can do. While brooding over the issue, Chris gets inspired to come up with a whole new system, using frozen bromide in the test process. With this new revelation, Chris gets super excited and immediately begins to look for his partner, Mitch. Later that night, Chris tells Jerry about his new idea, and they decide to try it out the next day. After explaining the concept to the team, Chris decides to demonstrate how it works to them. The laser machine works just exactly as Chris had expected, causing great damage across different surfaces, even metals. With this success, Jerry assures Chris that he will graduate, and also promise to hand him the promised job. On hearing this, Kent begins to protest against it, stating that Jerry had promised him the job, but Jerry ignores him and walks away. Afterward, Chris and Mitch decide to celebrate their success with friends at a bar. While celebrating, Laszlo walks into the bar and joins them. After a while, Laszlo throws a question at them, asking them what they think their laser machine will be used for. Being in the mood of celebration, Chris says he only cares about graduating, while Mitch tells Laszlo that engineers will figure out a use for it. However, Laszlo reveals to them that he thinks it's a weapon based on how it was designed to function, with limited firing time, unlimited range, and a tracking system. It sounds like a potential weapon. With this, Chris realizes that Laszlo is right, and they immediately rush to the lab, but as soon as they realize that the laser machine has already been moved. Shortly after, Laszlo suggests that they find out what Jerry is trying to do first. Shortly after that, they pump a sleeping gas into Kent's room, making him pass out. Next, they implant a radio transmitter in his mouth to create an illusion that God is speaking to him. Afterward, Mitch begins to talk into his head, making him believe he's hearing from Jesus. Mitch asks him what he knows about the laser beam, and Kent subsequently reveals to them that he once heard Jerry talking about a classified test on the 27th. Next, Jordan traces Jerry to a classified Air Force base in the desert to confirm the location of the event. Later that night, the group breaks into Jerry's house and stocks it with boxes of popcorn. Soon, Jordan crafts a fake ID for Mitch and Chris as they manage to sneak into the airbase as private technicians. Inside the airbase, Mitch and Chris successfully sneak into the B-1 bomber airplane, where the weapons have been installed. Subsequently, they manage to reprogram the coordinates of the target, directing it to Jerry's house. The next day, Kent, who is now doubting his health status, begins to research on how to diagnose schizophrenia, thinking he now has one. Shortly after, Mitch speaks into his head again, this time instructing him to go stand outside Jerry's house at 7:08 a.m. Meanwhile, Chris and Mitch had invited a renowned professor at Pacific Technical University named Professor Gene and a congressman named Dugan to come to witness the test, telling them about Jerry's mischievous plans. Moments later, Kent arrives at Jerry's door seeking to hear from Jesus again, but he doesn't get any response. With this, he decides to go inside against Jesus' will, even as they call out to him, telling him not to go inside. Back at the base, Jerry explains how the weapon works to the generals, and they subsequently launch the B-1 aircraft into space. After a 10-second countdown, the laser gets fired from space, hitting Jerry's house and destroying everything in its path. However, the large bag of popcorn is heated by the laser, which is then refracted by a prism block positioned at Jerry's window, causing the popcorn to start popping. Subsequently, the popcorn fills the entire house, forcing Kent to swim out in a pool of popcorn as Mitch and Chris run to save him. Back at the base, Jerry realizes that the experiment had failed, but he was sure that the shot got fired. With this, he quickly requests that the machine should be shut down. However, it was too late as the laser machine soon caught fire, rendering it useless. With this, Jerry decides to check where the shot went, and he soon realizes that it was directed to his house. Later, Laszlo arrives in an RV which he had won in a sweepstake contest, and announces his marriage to a lady named Sherry Noogle before leaving to start a new life. Later that day, Hathaway arrives to see his beloved house covered in popcorn, realizing that he has just lost all for nothing. And the movie ends here. If you'd like to see us recap any other movies or topics you have in mind, just drop a comment and let us know. And don't forget to hit the like button, share this recap, and subscribe to stay updated for the next one. Until next time.